How good are you at spotting a fake ID? Probably not as good as you think. Bogus IDs are more sophisticated than ever. Even experienced bouncers have trouble telling fakes from real IDs. Selling cannabis to minors can result in huge fines and can even cost dispensaries their license. That's why Veriscan, by IDscan.net, protects their dispensary partners by performing more than 75 algorithmic checks on each ID's barcode. So if your dispensary is worried about inadvertently selling cannabis to a minor, you should look into Veriscan by IDscan.net. They're offering listeners of this podcast free white glove setup. So just go to IDscan.net to join the over 1,000 North American dispensaries and 9 of the 10 largest MSOs who are confidently bringing plant medicine to legal-aged consumers. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Deadhead Cannabis Show. I'm Larry Mishkin of Mishkin Law in Chicago. I have a great show for you today. We have a great show, one of my favorites. We have a great guest in Bob Hoban, and I hope you'll listen, and we're going to learn a lot and have a lot of fun. Today, it's early April. That means, for me at least, it's the beginning of Europe 72. During these 2 months, you have to give it a little bit of homage. It's a tremendous tour. I think one of their best ever. And we're going to pluck a show from there today that we have not covered in years past. April 11th, City Hall, Newcastle, England, the third show of the tour, and one that they kind of threw in at the last minute. And we'll talk more about that. But let's hear our opening track from Grateful Dead, April 11th, 1972. But you ain't got age, you can't close the door. Moses stood up a full 6'10". He said you can't close the door when the walls caved in. Asked him for water, he both missed the plan. We finished the bottle and broke into mine. You get what you come for, you're ready to go. And it's a 1 in 10,000 enough for the show. Even having eyes picking on a well, from the cross with the water we fell. Cool, clean water where you can never tell. So, great song, brand new at that time, had just come out on Ace. Greatest story ever told. Bobby and Donna wailing away. Great high energy thing. And this is the perfect time to turn to our guest today, Bob Hoban of Clark Hill. Bob is a accomplished lawyer in the marijuana field. Anybody in marijuana knows who Bob is. He writes for a number of publications. He has his own podcast, The Hoban Minute, and all fair and full disclosure, I used to work with Bob for a few years, and I'm delighted to have an opportunity to talk with him. He's been in our show once before. So here he is, the guy who's as honest as a Denver man can be, Bob Hoban. Bob, welcome to the show.
Larry, it's good to be here. It's a long time coming. I'm super excited to talk cannabis and dead with you. And incidentally, you mentioned it briefly, but I do have to say, I think that maybe our time together and the work we all did collectively, not just you and I, but by extension, 50 plus of us at the Hoban Law Group, that may have been the greatest story ever told.
Nicely done. And, that would be hard to argue, right? In the words of the immortal Steve Shane, the Hoban Law Group wasn't just the best at what they did. They were the only ones who did it. And that certainly rang true for me professionally. and personally, it was a wonderful time, and gave me a great introduction into the world of legal cannabis, for which I am forever grateful. So, let's. I know you're a big Bob Weir fan, and that's great because I like Bob too. But I know you really like him, and we're going to get a lot of Bob today. And here he was kind of flexing his wings, and during the Primal Dead era, as we like to call it, he was part of the whole thing. But this was when they were all starting to write their own tunes, and Bobby had a chance to really get out there and flex. And this was as good a tune as any, off of Ace from that time period. Your thoughts?
Well, this is as good as anything. I agree, but I got to tell you that black throated wind on there, and when they're working that song out, also coming from the Ace album, and if I'm not mistaken, that's a Barlow Weir combo there on Black Throated Wind, and I always think about when I'm driving on the highway, passing me by buses and semis, and there's a certain line in that song when they talk about St. Louis, the city of blue, and basically. Jerry comes in with a little tweak, and over time, that little blues riff got a little bit more pronounced and a little bit louder. But here it was a good first take.
Yep, you know what? You're absolutely right. And look, these guys are so sharp, and this is one of the reasons why it's fun talking with you, just like my co-host Rob Hunt when he's in town. But it helps when people have that kind of deep inside knowledge. And you're right, Black Throated Wind is wonderful, and I probably would have featured it, but we just featured it from another show a couple of weeks ago. And quite frankly, anytime it's in a show, I think it's going to always be one of my favorites from that show. And St. Louis mention notwithstanding, but something that we've always appreciated, that and in Big River. So, if you ever see a show in St. Louis, we wait for those two songs to get lined up and then jump all over them. But what I like about this show, Bob, is Europe 72 was a great tour. And one of the reasons why I think it was is because it was so last minute, in typical Dead fashion. So many things weren't quite planned out. And they wound up in Newcastle because that was the port to take the ferry over to Denmark, where they were going next. And they were on their way, and they had a night in Newcastle, and they decided they would do a show. And so they got Newcastle City Hall, which the Dead described as a dour concrete building in the midst of a grim industrial town on the border of Scotland, had all the warmth of a witch's teat, concrete columns throughout blocking all the sight lines and playing havoc with the sound. But it turns out it was a famous venue, and a lot of British bands had played there. And in fact, Newcastle had been the home for the guys and the Animals, including Eric Burdon. Eric Burdon's mom went to this Dead show just to see if any of the people there knew her son, Eric, and some of them did. And Sting is also from Newcastle. So off they went. But Sam Cutler, the tour manager, said, when the show started, the locals kind of just stood there drop-jawed at what was going on. They were stunned and bemused, but within a few minutes, the concrete walls somehow turned into green pastures. Rays of California sunshine permeated the gloom of the soulless building, and the people from Newcastle relaxed and got into the music. There's nothing like a Grateful Dead concert, and this one was no exception. That's very visual. I can see that happening.
I can see it in real time, and you can see the people, like you said, with their jaws dropped, seeing this show develop. And, as fans as we are, as we look at this show has a lot of things that are really, really great. First of all, you've got this sort of textbook, Bob Weir, greatest story ever told, Ace, Bobby starting to get out on the stage and doing Bobby songs, right? And, this was the beauty of the Grateful Dead, by the way, which also was indicative in many ways of our work together, was everybody got to play lead. Everybody got to be out in front of the band. So when this show was no different, you've got Bobby Rockstar in a certain respect, developing in the early 70s as a young man, right? You've got Jerry with Sugaree and Deal doing Jerry things, textbook Jerry. And then you got the Pig doing Pigpen things. And that's an important piece of the puzzle, right? Because the show really gets going after playing in the band, and then next time you see me, things start to rip, and then that's where Pigpen starts to get into his groove and get comfortable. And if you read about this tour, Pigpen was not well on this tour, so it was a miracle that he had the energy and the enthusiasm. After all, he was ill, he was drinking, there was a lot of things going on. So this tour, as you point out, was slapped together generally at the last minute. This particular venue was very much at the last minute, and this show's got all the components of a high level Grateful Dead show. And then you move into the second set, and you've got little bit of trucking, but then you come out with the other one. So you've got some typical Jerry things. I mean, think about the guitar in China Cat, down to "I Know You Rider" with
Oh, sure.
I mean, this whole show's got a little bit of everything, which is why it's such a great one. And you can imagine being in that hall, that concrete hall, and the reverb coming through there. You wouldn't even have needed to see through those columns to know what was going on.
Well, or you think you were seeing through the columns, right? If you were sitting next to the right people.
If you did it right, if you did it right.
That's very true. Well, here, let's listen to one more tune really fast because this also is a special time in terms of Jerry and the instruments he was playing. And for a few years in the early 70s, he was fooling around with the pedal steel guitar. And on this tour, just for Looks Like Rain, just for that song, they brought the pedal steel along with them. So, Dan, spin it for us. Let's hear a little Looks Like Rain with Jerry doing it.
It's all right. I love you. That's not gonna change. Run me around, make me hurt again and again. But I'll still sing you love songs written in the letters of your name. Pray the storm to come, for it surely looks like rain. Whoa, surely looks like rain.
So obviously what I love about that is the pedal steel, but here's what I want to ask you. You can tell how fresh and new the song is and how young Bobby is. His voice is so powerful when he's singing it, and it's a really great mashup with Donna. I can't always say that I'm the biggest Donna fan, but on some of these songs, she really hits the right spot. And I love that about Bobby. I love that young Bobby voice full of energy.
Full of energy, and of course we all have we all love Donna, but we all have mixed opinions about different segments of time and her effectiveness. And this is kind of a funny thing, but it's also an interesting thing. There's a lot of on YouTube. There's isolation of Bobby playing rhythm guitar and the ingenuity and the creativity and how he really rewrote how to play rhythm guitar. When you isolate his playing is great. Now, I would say the same thing about Donna, but because there's a couple of clips on YouTube where they isolate Donna, and sometimes it sounds like somebody pushed her out of an airplane. But that's neither here nor there.
Well, you're funny, and that's a very apt description in some instances. But in speaking with David Gans when he was a guest on our show, one of the lessons we took away was what an important part of the band she was, how much beloved she was by everybody in the band, and and all of her great contributions. And that's always good to hear because you never want to think that they were associating themselves with somebody who wasn't somebody like that. And there are definitely Playing in the Band. I love her on Playing in the Band, especially on the reprise with Bobby, and and really getting into that. And there's a lot of other great stuff. And Europe '72, she was also relatively new to the band at that point, and just kind of finding herself, and stepped right up and made a name for herself there too, I think.
No, she definitely did. And I mean, look, there's so many great Donna things. And just the dynamic with the band too. It really did change the perception. I mean, this band, the Warlocks, didn't become the Grateful Dead by accident, but they also didn't become the Grateful Dead by design, right? This was they kept adding people. I mean, the notion of two drummers and the story behind bringing the two drummers in, the story of bringing Donna in, and the need for the keyboardist at the time and how all that worked out. All of those things had shaped the history of this band and its evolution. And I mean, there are periods of time where I wish Donna would refrain from belting away, but most of the time, far more than not, I love it. But it's without that dynamic, certainly for large periods of time, the band would not have progressed the way that they did, which is great. And by the way, there's also some beautiful singing by her. If you go to one of the Shakedown Street studio album, when you look at a couple of those instrumental tunes with her in the background, and what the heck's the
France.
France? The,
France, yeah, and From the Heart of Me, yeah.
yes, yeah.
She's got a couple out there that she got to sing from time to time, absolutely, and that's all good. And I love your description of them as kind of it wasn't a plan that everybody looked down the road for. It was a plan that evolved over time. When the right people came along, they picked up the people and they ran with it. And again, as long as we're throwing these apt descriptions back and forth, you can also take credit for that, Bob, which I think makes us all wonder whether you sat down and wrote your business plan after listening to a bunch of Grateful Dead. But it certainly might have been the case. I don't want to go away from this though without really circling back for a minute to Garcia and that pedal steel. He started playing it a lot with the New Riders. In fact, that was one of the reasons why he and Marmaduke formed the New Riders, is they loved playing together so much with Jerry on the pedal steel. But it only made a very brief presence with the Grateful Dead as a touring band. And primarily it was saved for Looks Like Rain. On the Garcia album, he plays it on To Lay Me Down and The Wheel and Spider God, which is one of those songs that you never really know, but they played in the Grateful Dead movie at the beginning. And so, it kind of took on a cult status of his own. But where Jerry really got a lot of notice for playing the pedal steel was on the Teach Your Children on the Deja Vu album for Crosby, Stills and Nash. He plays pedal steel on that song, and we all know it. If you can sing the song in your head for a minute, and if not, go home and play it. And right away, you can't help but notice Jerry and his pedal steel. And the thing is, at the time, it was relatively new for him. He had only just started playing it not that long before. He self-taught. He never took a lesson, and he really nailed it. But what I really like about it, Bob, is that they didn't pay him. The deal he made was he would play pedal steel for them on this tune, and they would teach the Grateful Dead how to harmonize, which they were then able to utilize on Working Man's Dead and American Beauty. And, on those albums, the Dead really do have some great vocal harmonizing. And, of course, Crosby, Stills, and Nash were the masters of it.
Well, that's what I was going to mention. I mean, Jerry integrated that beginning in about 69, I think, till about 74. It was a mainstay. But also, he recorded, to your point, with Crosby, with Stills, with Nash separately, typically on albums. He was their sort of studio guitarist on the pedal steel and several of those. He was on a few Jefferson Airplane songs as well. So and I guess Starship when they moved around. But at the end of the day, I mean, this is only as much as Jerry Garcia was this living legend and the centerpiece of the Grateful Dead for so long. He was something to so many other people in so many different ways as well outside of the Grateful Dead. And those are the things that in and of itself would have been an amazing career, let alone what he did with the Dead. But, obviously we missed the guy. But to your point earlier, I'm a huge Bobby fan. I've always thought that, Bobby was, maybe maligned or sort of treated differently. And I believe in many ways there were periods of time where Jerry's drug use was harder than others, and Bobby sort of kept the band together. In a sense that, Rockstar Bobby, some people like to say that's cheesy, but Rockstar Bobby, in my opinion, saved the Dead on multiple occasions, and we still love that stuff when we hear it even to this day. Although maybe with the one exception, if you haven't done this recently, do yourself a favor and watch the videos from the 1980s off of the album with Touch of Grey and oh gosh, what the heck? Anyway, it'll come back to me. But
Right.
The video from damn, Larry, I can't remember the damn song. It's got a duck in it. It's a ridiculous Bob Weir video from the 1980s, indicative of what was going on at the time. But
yeah, that was that Going to Hell in a Bucket?
Hell in a Bucket,
One of
Hell in
those,
a Bucket, exactly.
and he's in the bar with those guys,
Yes,
and they're all looking
yes.
mean and nasty, and yes.
So Bobby brought some of this on himself with the short shorts and everything else. But in many ways, I think Bobby really was the centerpiece of the band, centered to Jerry, but also through periods of time got us through. And this is early Bobby stuff. I listen to Ace as a regular matter. I listen to Rat Dog albums as a regular matter. Most people don't even know who Rat Dog is, but if you don't, pick up Evening Moods or Live at Roseland, and you're in for a treat.
No, you know what? You're absolutely right. There's so many great things, and I was just reading a story the other day where somebody was commenting on how Bobby's skills as a rhythm guitar player often got overlooked just because how strong Garcia plays. And just to divert for 1 second, this past Saturday night, I had an opportunity to go see Tedeschi Trucks at one of their nights when they do their annual residency here in Chicago at the Chicago Theater. It's always great fun, and it's always the same thing where we sit there and we say, Susan Tedeschi, man, she's beautiful. She has an amazing voice. She plays guitar like any rock legend out there, but she's standing next to Derek Trucks and everybody's watching him all night. It's hard when when you're standing next to a guy who's kind of not only just talented but revered for that talent. And but Bobby, I always thought that he was the guy that reached out to the world. I don't think anybody ever looked at Jerry Garcia and said, "Wow, I'm going to follow the Grateful Dead." But I'm sure a lot of people looked at Bobby and thought, "Wow, look at this guy. He's young, he's energetic, he looks like a rock star." And I think he filled a lot of roles for them in that regard. And he should get his props for playing guitar. You and I were lucky enough to see him in Chicago last year when he came through with Wolf Brothers, and that was a tremendous show.
Tremendous show, and I have to tell you, I saw Bobby down in Dead and Co. down in Mexico at the earlier this year, and Bobby's healthy. I don't know if you see his Instagram videos. He's a workout model these days, but his voice is healthy. It's strong, maybe with a little help from technology, but he sounds great. The band sounds great, and for this final tour, I'm pretty excited as well. But just another note, though, you think about Bobby, you think about Jerry, but this show, remember, this was a rock and roll blues band. This was Pigpen's band. Pigpen was the strong-headed personality that brought this group together. Pigpen drove this, and again, these are sort of the waning days of Pigpen as his health deteriorated and his alcohol consumption increased, so forth and so on. But at the end of the day, when you listen to that Good Lovin' and his riff where he's talking to the crowd and he's talking about just hugging your neighbor and being that is the kind of stuff that the band not intentionally moved away from, because Bobby brought some of that back into the mix. But when Pigpen was gone, we kind of lost that connection, that kind of connection to the audience in a major way. But going back to Dead and Co., that is why I love the addition of John Mayer. He's controversial. Not everybody likes John Mayer, but John Mayer has blues roots, and he
plays guitar. He's great.
And those blues roots was where the band started, and it ultimately deviated away from that. In many ways, so it's still kept in it, and then it came back to it with Dead and Company over the years. So I don't know, lots of exciting stuff. Incidentally, John Mayer was here in Denver a couple of nights ago. I was unaware; I only saw it after the fact. But he apparently played a couple Dead tunes, and while most of that show might have been a little poppy for me, I do regret not going, because I do admire the guy, and just to see how he channels what he channels on stage at the beginning, I thought that was cheesy, and sort of grew to love it. But Bobby's still the anchor of that band.
Bobby's the anchor of that band. You know what? And to give John Mayer credit, I mean, I think this makes Dead and Co. far and away the longest running group of Grateful Dead members since the original band, right? This is longer than when they played as the Dead or the other ones, or any of the other names that they've played under, and that cements John Mayer as the second longest lead guitar player for the band. And he took the time and the effort to really make it work out, so much so that with the help of Jay Blakesberg and others, they were able to set him up to play Wolf guitar at Citi Field, where the Mets play a few years ago, when the guitar was in New York at the museum, the Modern Art, the Museum of Modern Art, whichever museum it was at, when they were showing the guitars of famous rock and roll people. And deservedly so. He is a great talent. And it kind of begs the question now. I mean, it's hard to believe that all of these, Bob Weir certainly doesn't look like he's slowing down anytime soon. And I don't know what the drummers are going to do, but it just leads to, now we can start rampantly speculating about what the next group is going to be. Who are they going to pull together next? And there's always a few guys in the group like Jeff Comenti, who you figure are always going to be there. But I'll be very curious to see what Bobby does. And one thing I like is it seems that both Bobby and Phil have taken a real liking to the band Goose, and especially their lead guitar player, Mick Mitrotando, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, and if I'm not, I apologize. We're going to see them in a couple of weeks, and I'm excited to have a chance to do that. But I love that. The jam band scene is reloading right away with somebody new, and if Bobby and Phil are willing to play with guys like that, I think it's a great thing.
Yeah, no, Goose was at Playing in the Sand down in Mexico. So we saw them one night, and just fantastic, great band. Played a lot of their own stuff. They played some covers that just made you cry. And at the end of it, I don't know. I think that there's no heir apparent. It's like saying, who's the next Michael Jordan? There's never another Michael Jordan, not Kobe Bryant, not anybody. Michael Jordan was Michael
Thank
Jordan.
you.
But at the same time,
Thank you.
who's the band that sort of takes that following and takes that mantle? We'll see. We'll see. Because, I don't know if you've noticed, I look in the mirror every morning. None of us are getting any younger. So
No, that's very true. As my kids will always point out gladly and, without even trying too hard. Well, this is fun. And, folks, here's the thing. Bob and I could fill an hour talking about Grateful Dead without even trying. As you can hear, it just bounces back and forth, and I would love to keep doing it. However, we have to respect the fact that there are not a lot of people in the United States today, legal or otherwise, who have the experience, the knowledge, the background, the overall, not just the feel for the industry, but the respect that the industry shows back to him. And we are more than remiss, we're negligent if we don't take a little bit of time to talk with Bob about what's going on in the industry. And I know, Bob, that we're going to get to hemp in 1 minute, and I know you've been doing a lot with that. But I just want to very quickly just kind of tap into your overall thoughts of where you think the legal cannabis market is right now. One of the things that Rob and I had been noticing in weeks past was the large number of businesses, mostly in Canada, but some in the United States, that were laying off huge numbers of workers and were, really fighting to stay above ground. And, prices are plummeting, and people in California, the Garcia brand abandoned California. And where do you see the legal cannabis market now, and where do you see it going in the next year or two?
Well, first of all, here's the thing with legal cannabis. Everybody talks about, there's a lot of circumspection or decision making on behalf of consumers about what brands and what products they buy. And I hate to say it, Larry, the data suggests the exact opposite. Consumers will buy the lowest price thing as long as it's consistent, right? And lowest price wraps in the taxes too, so it becomes a little bit of a conundrum. But look, early 2020, recession proof. Everybody was using cannabis more than they had. And even more so that the regular users were using it, because everybody was home. We were locked down. Work was from home. So numbers went up dramatically. But the problem with the numbers going up dramatically in terms of consumption and use was that production was also being invested in quite heavily at that point in time. It was either underway or it was ramped up to meet that demand. Well, then everybody went back to work, and that demand, while the demand continues similarly, the amount of purchase numbers from each particular buyer has gone down. So you're looking at the fact that there's more production and there's a demand that is somewhat steady, but because of the production demand lapse or imbalance, if you will, the industry is in dire straits. Interestingly enough, this is an industry that is always looking for a capital raise. At no point is there a company that sits back and says, well, we're good enough with our revenues and our expansion, and we're going to sit back and ride this. It just every week, every month, every year is focusing on a capital raise. And that equity dollars have dried up dramatically. So you're looking at, in North America, you're looking at debt. You take on lending, and there's a lot of money in lending, but it comes at quite a price. And we don't even see a lot of those loans being flexible and have convertible clauses, meaning that they'd convert it to equity or cancel some of the debt if the company's performing well or otherwise. So that's created a bit of a challenge. But there are some sweet spots. There's still equity investment in, for example, the acquisition of consulting firms and fintech solutions, because those are the gateway to the industry as it becomes more balanced. There's still an interest in North America in emerging or new markets like New York, like New Jersey, like Missouri. California is sort of coming back in terms of price stabilization. But where the action is at is the global supply chain. And of course, that does not touch the United States. You have the European Union. Germany is weeks, if not a couple of months away from finalizing their legislative scheme. Countries in Western Europe will follow Germany's lead, one after the other. That will create an increased demand. It just begs the question as to whether dispensaries with high regulations and high taxes is really where this belongs. At the end of the day, I think that was a nice way to come out of the box from a policy perspective. It gave parents, it gave your average person, your soccer mom, so to speak, and policymakers. It gave them comfort that this industry was going to not just run wild and create a scourge on society. But now that we've proven that, we have to reevaluate what is really a 10-year-old overtaxed, overregulated dispensary model. And I think some of the things that go towards that are loosening it up. I think Cookies has innovative approaches to how they have a cookies corner. I think that you saw Circle K come out of the box recently and put out a press release. I don't believe there's any action there, but a press release that says we're going to put cannabis sales in our stores. The model has to change and reflect the fact that this is not quite mainstream, but it's accepted by more people now in the United States and beyond than ever. And it's normalized and regulation works. It's just the taxes are too high and the strict regulation, not that it needs to be less strict, but some of these things are inapplicable and unnecessary, frankly, and that's killing these businesses. So we have to look at a broader model. And, that's kind of why we've always talked about, I look at hemp, I look at marijuana, and I say marijuana because that's a legal term, and I think as lawyers we're sort of bound by that because the cannabis industry has both sides. And then I think there's a third very distinct industry there, and that's the cannabinoid industry, because that could be synthetic, it could be natural, but cannabinoids are not necessarily easily jammable into either one of those two boxes. So anyway, things are positive. There's still growth. It's just not that exponential growth we've seen for the last 13, 14, 15 years.
Okay, well, I appreciate that, and you mentioned something, and I'm curious about this. I know a year or two ago you integrated the Hoban Law Group into Clark Hill, and as a result, Clark Hill is obviously a very large and well-known firm with a lot of very big corporate clients, and without obviously we don't need to know any names or anything like that, but being in that firm, what is your sense as to corporate America's view on legalized marijuana? Are they generally for it? Are they against it? Are they just going to take a step back and wait and see what happens?
I think the one word that comes to mind is uninformed. I can tell you my experience in joining Clark Hill, that other lawyers in the firm that have large clients, whether they're grocery stores, C-stores, healthcare systems, oil and gas companies, Larry, you'd be surprised at where these they want to know, what is the industry all about? They want to know about, are there investment opportunities, whether that's for themselves or for the company? And they want to know about how their particular field or industry plugs in. And it's something you and I have talked about for a very long time, is the cannabis plant is not just smokable. It's not just consumable. It's, when you look at all these uses of the cannabis plant, industries will be using hemp or forms of cannabis. All industries will within the next 15 to 25 years. There's not a question in my mind. We have to, because it's the only sustainable crop out there that really is a dry land crop. It doesn't require as much water as these other crops. But my point is, I've talked to countless large-scale Fortune 500 companies about what those questions mean to them. And they're still sitting on the sidelines because they had no idea that the industry was as big as it is. But they're also large scale, oftentimes multinational, oftentimes public companies. And so even this sales, even though on the scale these numbers are large, they're still small numbers to these very large international corporate interests. So they're not going to force something that might be federally illegal. If that is federally illegal on the marijuana side, of course, when you're talking about the U.S., they're not going to force it for a marginal increase in dollars on one side or the other. But they are actively participating, and they're behind the scenes, pushing for policy change, but they're waiting for that, based on my experience. Now, that's not to say these consumer product manufacturers are not sort of doing one-off brands, testing the market with a CBD product, maybe even with a Delta 9 hemp product. But at the end of the day, they're not necessarily putting those out under the broad banners that we've seen for other consumer goods.
Okay, well, thank you. One other quick question I want to ask you in the marijuana world is this: as you know, and we've talked about forever, I'm based here in Illinois, and Illinois has not been the poster child for how you want to roll out a marijuana program. We're 3 years into the program, and maybe one of the new dispensary license people is finally up and operating, maybe 2 out of 150 or so. Everything was tied up for 3 years. There were so many problems. I contrast that with my home state, Missouri. Missouri in 87 days after the legislation was passed in the Missouri legislature, they were up and running with 200 dispensaries and blowing by Illinois in numbers because they had far more operating dispensaries. And, it seems like such a disparity to me, in terms of the way one state operates versus the way the other state operates. Oklahoma, they obviously went with nothing at all. Basically, anyone could sign up and start operating. But, from your perspective, where do you see, is an appropriate kind of like middle ground in terms of what level of involvement a state should have, knowing on the one hand, it's necessary to maintain a workable market. But on the other hand, boy, if we look at Illinois, it's just kicked the hell out of everything as far as this industry is concerned.
Well, listen, I defer to your experience in the Illinois market. I've worked in that market. I know it somewhat well, but the history of Illinois politics, Chicago politics, that colors my thinking. And, we'd be remiss if we didn't say that has something to do with how this rolled out. In other words, at least by perception, everyone in that chain from local governments onto the top, they've got their hand out in some way. And I don't necessarily mean that in a nefarious way all the time. Sometimes that just means they want to assert additional control within their jurisdiction. But sometimes it does mean they have their hand out in that, sort of underhanded kind of way. But my point is, I think that sort of mucked up the rollout of the program. Whereas you have other programs that are just crystal clear, and it's not built in so that every stakeholder or interest holder can assert themselves. So the Missouri program was quite simple, right? State approval, local government approval on various things like land use, zoning, basic things that local governments can control, and they ultimately have the ability to jive with the state on that. So it's a very simple process. But when everyone wants to, and seemingly, I don't know Missouri politics at all, except to say seemingly, the people whose hands were out or that wanted to assert additional control, they kind of stood back a little bit. Maybe because it's a little bit more of a conservative jurisdiction and they wanted to see how this was going to go versus a more progressive jurisdiction like Illinois, where people were, all right, this is going to happen. Let's take part in it and participate and drive it. Versus in Missouri, it might have been, well, let's wait and see how this goes. This might not go so well. We don't want to be involved. So that I think colors it a little bit too. But as we've evolved, we see what regulatory frameworks work and which ones don't. And there's 2 or 3 or 4 very key sections of a regulatory framework that will dictate whether or not it's going to have more trouble or not. Some of that has to do with taxation. Some of that has to do with outside investment. Some of that has to do with who and what needs to be disclosed in terms of ownership and control. And some of that has to do with zoning and whether there's license caps on that. If you address those 4 or 5 issues, you can take a program that has a lot of difficulty like Illinois and make it a program that rolls out at least smoothly like a Missouri or, dare I say, my home state of New Jersey. So far, so good. The conditional licenses on the social equity program are rolling out seemingly quite efficiently.
Well, I'm glad that somebody got it right because I think it's a wonderful concept, but it was just wrong here from the very beginning. And it being Illinois, nobody was really interested in talking about it and let it play out like it always does. And so, we're seeing the end results of it. But I couldn't have been more impressed with Missouri. As a resident from Missouri, I can't always say 100% that I'm proud to say that I'm from the state, except when we talk about the Cardinals, of course. But in this instance, far and away, Missouri really kicked ass, and my hat's off to them. And all my friends that I know down there who have participated have had nothing but good things to say about it. So good for them. Before we flip over to the hemp side, I don't want to lose track totally of our Grateful Dead discussion today. So let's dive back into the show for a minute. In a second here, I'm going to have Dan spin our next clip. It's Truckin'. And I picked this version of it because in 1972, Truckin' again was practically brand new, just having come out on American Beauty. It is a primarily a Bob tune, even though they all participated in writing it, except Pigpen, who apparently went upstairs to take a nap and missed out on it. But when they play it, it sounds good. It's got great energy. It becomes a standard for them that you can never go more than 3 or 4 shows to see the Grateful Dead without hearing it. But the real reason why I picked this version is because in this version, I think the jamming alone stands out. So we're going to play a clip here, no version, just the jam, because it's that hot. So I hear that, and I just chalked that up to their remaining energy from their Primal Dead days being channeled into, a more Americana style of music. And it takes that song and it pushes it along in a way that's just so wonderful to hear.
Well, it does, but the Americana comes through in the lyrics too, right? When
Oh, yeah.
when you think about, we're talking about Dallas, we're talking about Houston, we're talking about New York, just this whole thing being on the road, it's very much an extension, by the way, of sort of the Kerouac on the road notion, right?
Yes.
And
Yes.
that's a combination that I love, that is not talked about enough when you think about the Grateful Dead and and its evolution. Being here in Denver, where Kerouac spent so much time physically, but also in terms of just writing and writing about it. And incidentally, in our new office, we have a speakeasy room that we've named the Kerouac Room, which is kind of cool. But
Sure.
at the end of the day, watching the NCAA tournament fairly recently, and Bill Walton pulled out an old favorite when he was asked about the University of Houston. He did say Houston was too close to New Orleans, but I've also heard him say it probably a dozen times. So
uh, he's funny. You're absolutely right about that connection, and by my way of thinking, at least, what finally brought it all together for me was the Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test by Tom Wolfe, where he talks about focused on the acid test, of course, but the pivotal role that the Grateful Dead played in that whole thing, and as a result, the benefit that it gave the Grateful Dead in really coming out and being recognized, if you will, as America's psychedelic band, and kind of gave them that mantle that they could run with for a long, long time, even as they eventually did change over their musical style. But you're absolutely right. It's fun to hear. It's great stuff. And again, at a time, Europe '72, when they were really at the top of their game, one of the things about a tour like Europe '72 that I like, and we've talked about in the past, is that because there were so many shows in such an isolated period of time, and that a large part of their set lists rolled over pretty quickly. They were playing monster shows, 2.5, 3 hour shows, sometimes even longer. So certain songs, like Playing in the Band, the first time you hear it, it sounds one way. By the time you get to the end of the tour, you hear it, it sounds another way. They've been taking these tunes, they've been working them out, they've been doing great things with it. And, I think that this tour is where Truckin' really kind of stepped to the forefront for both Bobby and the band as a real banner tune that, they could play, and anybody is going to stand up and dance to that one.
Yes, 100%. And with this tour also, had a lot of great stuff, but underlooked as a Grateful Dead, in the repertoire, but even in this show, Mr. Charlie. Larry, Mr. Charlie gets the crowd going. I have no idea why it was not a more prominently played tune. When you get that song going, it's a feel-good song. It gets everybody moving, and I don't think there was enough. I'd say the same thing about the wheel separately as well. We didn't hear enough wheel over the last 40 or 50 years, I suppose. But one of the songs from this tour, not on this concert, but He's Gone. The He's Gone from the 1972 show. Also because the story behind it was so timely, with Mickey's father running off with her money, but because it was heartfelt. And at the end of the day, I remember when Jerry died, and I put lyrics up on a chalkboard in my house, visiting my mom at home. Like a locomotive rolling down the tracks. He's gone, never come back. So, and at that point in time, I was a young man at the time, or a lot younger. I didn't know that the song was about Mickey's father. I thought He's Gone meant somebody was gone, this and that, because it resonated to me at that point in time.
Pigpen. We all thought Pigpen.
Yeah. So anyway,
but no.
But great He's Gone through that entire tour.
Absolutely. Well, here, another one, and we're really rolling in the Bobby today. I want to roll into the other one really fast, because this is also amazing. Now, at this time in '72, these other ones were enormous. In fact, this one from the show clocks in at almost 26 minutes. And there's so much jamming in there where the focus is really on the music, not quite as much on the lyrics. And you don't get, that cutesy stuff like in the later years, where when Bobby was singing the lyrics, they were running it through a voice scrambler to make it sound all kind of weird and everything. But in this, from this part, again, I'm not so much interested in the lyrics. But I want you to listen to this jam. They call it the Feelin' Groovy Jam, and in my opinion, I think that really becomes the highlight of the song. Now the Fish kids these days call that a stage 2 jam, right? And when I finally got someone to define for me what a stage 2 jam is when the jam goes so long and so good you forget what song they're playing. And of course, we all had stage 2 jams. We just didn't call it that. But it's that kind of jam, right? Where you're listening to it. There's no lyrics. There's just music. And the music is almost telling a story, the way it's just kind of meandering about. And, if you really stop and let yourself get into it, you can forget what day of the week it is, as far as I'm concerned.
100%. When I travel and people ask me about music and I talk about the Grateful Dead, believe it or not, there are large populations in this world who have never heard of the band, wouldn't know a thing. So you have to describe what the Grateful Dead is. And it's a rock and roll.
Right.
Larry, how the hell do you describe what the Grateful Dead is? When you think about that song and then that whole suite of music, and you think about, for example, Terrapin Station and that whole suite of music, and then the Weather Report suite, what the hell is that stuff? No one's ever done anything like that before. Is that rock and roll? Is it, to your point, telling a story with a long jam, which it definitely is? But who does this? Where did this stuff come from? It's not trucking. It's not even the Bobby tunes. It's not even the spacey stuff. It's a long diatribe of a jam that comes from all parts of the band and is moving for, to your point, 15, 20, 25 minutes, and you don't even know where you are until they come back to a riff or a lyric that brings you back home. And that's the beauty of it. But how could you possibly describe those kind of songs and what that means to somebody that's never heard of the band? But that is what defines the band in many ways.
Well, no, you're right, and I've told all my friends over the years when they say to me, "What makes it so great?" You got to come see them live. We'll play a tape. No tape. You have to see them live. You have to be there in the moment. The music has to be around you. You have to be in and around the people. You have to feel the energy that the band creates, or conversely, that the crowd creates and passes back up to the band. And when you're in those moments and you're there, and they just kind of branch off and do this for a little while, you have no idea where they're going. You have no idea what they're doing. You wonder if they have any idea. And one of the things I've noticed over the years as well is while they're doing it, I noticed, like with when Fish plays on the jams, Trey teased this and Trey teased that, and Trey teased everything. And I guess you could hear a little bit of that with Jerry from time to time, but I just always thought that the band were borrowing and incorporating sounds from so many different musical sources to which they had all been exposed over time, and integrating that into what they did. A few weeks ago, we were listening to a show with a drum segment where they had Hamza Al-Din, who had played with them on their Egyptian shows back, and that stuff is just fascinating because it's new. It's something that we're not otherwise exposed to, but yet somehow they play it in a way that makes it feel right at home at a Grateful Dead show.
Yeah, no, 100%. And they do to this very day. And, again, the drummers lead those things in many ways in terms of where they're going to go with it. And to this very day, they do. But, I don't know, we could talk all day long about it, but at the end, and we have, and we will, but at the end of the day, look, this is a band beyond description. That's for sure. Yeah.
Oh, no, you're absolutely right. When you get to that level and you try, to really figure it all out, and you realize you can't figure it all out, and all you have to do is just keep exposing yourself to it. And given that at least on the day we're recording this, a big Jewish holiday is starting tonight. I've got friends who are very religious, and they go in and they do study all the time. They study what's called the Mishnah and other books of Judaism, and it's so dense and so deep, and the way they explain it to me sounds very much like us listening to Grateful Dead music, that you could listen to it forever, and every time you're picking up something new, a different nuance. You hear something a different way, or some particular line that you've had in your head forever, you hear it in another show. And you're like, oh my God, this, and you can make those connections, and out of those connections, you can extrapolate whatever you want. And to me, that's what makes it so great, and why we love talking about it. But I'm not going to pass up this opportunity while I have you on this show to talk about the other side of cannabis. We were just talking about marijuana, but I really want to switch over to the hemp side, and we can certainly talk about the commercial uses of hemp. But I want to focus on Delta 8 for a minute, because Delta 8 is like this thing that's out there. Everybody talks about it. Everybody thinks they know about it. People, does it get me high? Does it not get me high? Is it legal? Is it not legal? My clients call up, can we sell it? Can we not sell it? And then in the midst of all of this, we get the DEA once again kind of sticking their nose in where it doesn't belong and telling us that, well, we can enforce Delta 8 and we can put it on the controlled substance list because it's synthetically manufactured. And so therefore, we don't believe that means that it's one of the naturally derived cannabinoids that the Farm Bill speaks to. What the hell's going on with Delta 8, Bob?
That's a great question. So let's take that from the top as best we can. Did the framers, did Congress intend that these things like Delta 8, Delta 10, Delta 11, HHC, did Congress intend these to be legal? As lawyers, how do you determine intent, Larry? You look at the plain language. They could not have picked broader language, Larry. They say all derivatives, all salts, all extracts, all compounds, all isomers. Sure sounds to me that anything that comes out of the hemp plant, whether applied to some sort of process or not, is a legal compound. Doesn't mean it's regulated. That's a whole nother argument. What's legal versus what's regulated? Lawyers don't make that distinction enough because that's really prescient here. But at the end of the day, Farm Bill would suggest with very broad language that all of these compounds are legal. It also begs the question, because Delta 9 from hemp is no longer a controlled substance by the plain language.
Right.
Why are we pussyfooting around with Delta 8, Delta 10, and everything else if Delta 9 is the thing and it's legal? But that's another story for another day because there are limitations there.
Yes.
The Ninth Circuit Court in California has conclusively established in part of its holding, not dicta, not just a comment in the ruling. It said that Delta 8 and these types of extracts comfortably fit within the definition of the Farm Bill. So federal law would suggest that these are legal compounds very clearly. Will Congress address it this year? I don't think they will. I think they're leaving it to the states. The states are actively considering this, and you might read the press. The press seems to be a little biased against this one way or another. I'm simply reporting what I see. 60% of our clients are marijuana clients, and the other 40% are a mix of hemp and what I call cannabinoid clients. So we're very much in touch with both sides of this industry. But at the end of the day, the states are not looking to ban this stuff. They're looking to regulate it. And I'll throw out another concept, Larry. Maybe, just maybe, Delta 8, Delta 10 is red state weed, right? These are popping up in Tennessee, in Florida, in Alabama, in Arkansas, in Texas, in these conservative states that don't have marijuana dispensaries necessarily, or at least widespread commercial distribution because maybe it's a limited medical model. Kentucky, of all places, adopted both a Delta 8 regulatory structure and a medical marijuana structure within the last several days. So there are big movements to regulate this. Larry, 4 years ago, I thought this stuff was going away. 2 years ago, I was still thinking I'm on the fence about whether it goes away. I did not judge it or take a position of it one way or the other. It's here to stay, Larry. It's not going anywhere. It's huge business all over the world. The dollars from just Colorado, Virginia, and Florida's markets alone are in the billions with a B, billions and billions of dollars, tens of thousands of jobs, hundreds of millions of dollars of infrastructure. Governors are not going to send this stuff to the woodpile. They're just not, because that's sending industry out of their state. They might look at how to ban sales of retail in their state, but they'll allow for export. Or they might regulate the products and put age gates in place, which are appropriate. But this stuff is here to stay, and I think we have to stop being judgmental. You see the marijuana industry fighting against the sale of these products in dispensaries. Larry, how does that make any sense? If you're a store owner, it's your job to sell as many things as possible. That's what your investors, your board, your company deserves and requires. So why are you saying I don't want to sell products that people are buying to the tune of billions of dollars in a dispensary? Because the dispensary system is just going to distribute marijuana in the future? Come on. We see an overtaxed and overregulated model. Dispensaries can pivot and be leveraged to distribute a number of intoxicating compounds, but the marijuana industry at times doesn't see further than their nose. And that's not a knock. It's a protectionist thing. I get that. I get that, but it's the same thing with CBD. The early players didn't try to shut CBD down. What did they do, Larry? They created a nimble structure and they participated on both sides while preserving their marijuana licensure in state X, Y, and Z and preserving their ability to sell it over the counter or online everywhere. This is not a philosophical debate if it's business. It could be a philosophical debate between us whether this should be allowed or not, whether semi-synthetics should be allowed or not. The safety data would indicate that these things are safe if done properly, if regulated properly. There's still a lot of producers making it in their garage and bathtubs, and that stuff should not make it to the market, the marketplace, but it does. But it's here to stay, and I think people need to get their minds around it and realize that the dispensary system model is now 10 years old, Larry. 10 years old is old. It's old in terms of public policy. And that doesn't mean the system should go away, but it needs to diversify, particularly in its worst economic moment. And yet, for protectionist reasons that don't stand to reason at all, they're not allowing or even inviting the sales of these types of products in their stores. And these would generate revenues for the business and revenues for the state. So I don't get it. I think everyone's sort of holier than thou, but that doesn't surprise me because this industry was formed by a bunch of idealist and ambitious people that wanted to push that. We're part of that and proud to be part of it and proud to stand side by side with all these people. But I think that, sometimes philosophy has to yield to marketplace reality and consumer demand.
I think you're absolutely right. And out of all of that, the thing that I take away from it, and you and I have had this discussion before, as we kind of look to sum up the world in more of a 50-50 type of way, we're sitting here with something that defies partisanship, right? People in blue states like to smoke it. People in red states like to smoke it. I've seen last week, we were talking about the governor of Delaware, a Democrat who killed a marijuana bill. And then you read about other states where the Republican governors, Asa Hutchinson in Arkansas, was helping to push it through. And when I see that, to me, that's as true an indicator as anything when politicians are willing to really do the way they feel about it. And while I wish that the governor of Delaware wasn't trying to kill the bills, I'm hopeful that the people in that state will eventually find a way to get their bills passed. And to me, I think that, when we live in a country like this, and especially now we have Trump has been indicted and it'll be what it'll be. But these things, whether they're necessary or not, they drive wedges between us. And marijuana doesn't drive a wedge between us. I could be talking to a person from a red state all day long, and if we disagree on politics, we will certainly agree the minute we pull a joint out and start smoking it. And the conversation shifts to where was the weed from, and have you ever tried this brand? Have you ever tried that strain? And which frustrates me that we still can't get the Fair Safe Banking Act through the Senate because McConnell and Schumer each refused to give the other guy credit, for letting it go through. So I guess that's politics in a different way. But come on, people, this is here to stay. We don't have these raging partisanship issues over other things. We don't have to have it over this, and for the most part, we're not. Let's get these bills passed. Let's let people have bank accounts. Let's let dispensaries not have to mess around with 280E and actually be able to see if they can really earn a living, in a traditional way. There's no reason not to. 70% of the people in this country approve of legalized marijuana. That's that's not 50-50 anymore. We've ventured into, people are really, really behind this.
The rest of the world is behind this. This is happening all over the world, regardless of what the USA says. And that's an important thing to uncover. There is a global supply chain that exists right now. And it doesn't matter what's happening in the US. Yes, the US is the holy grail of consumer consumption and behaviors, right? And that's what everybody wants to access. But other countries, other continents are moving forward this en masse, and because of that, we can't just sit here and judge it, and we can't, in a state like Delaware or Maryland or wherever it is, look at this little fiefdom and say, oh, this is not good for us. Look at what the rest of the world's doing. Look what the studies show. By the way, you talk about sort of getting on the same page. The Delta 8 law passed unanimously in the Kentucky legislature. Larry, unanimously. Go back and look if anything's ever passed. I'm sure it has, but very seldom anything passes unanimously in Kentucky. This was an R&D sponsored measure on the most controversial topic there is, and it passed unanimously. So the point is that the things are changing, and it almost doesn't matter what happens in the U.S. because the rest of the world is evolving beyond us. And if safe banking and or the Climate Act does get passed, those international operators will make our companies and our multi-state operators look foolish and amateur because they'll have been used to operating by international standards. They'll have been used to shipping things across oceans and across continents and around the world, and ultimately being able to participate in a regulated marketplace that's accepted and recognized and free. And by the way, these countries have gone to the United Nations and sort of engaged in the United Nations with a dialogue. And you saw what the United Nations said to the U.S. a couple of weeks ago. You have to shut down your dispensaries in the different states. They didn't say to Germany, hey, Germany, don't move forward with your program. So it's about engaging in the dialogue and recognizing that if the U.S. wants to put its fingerprints on how this should roll out globally, it needs to do so now, or it's going to get left behind in terms of what the regulatory framework looks like. It will always have its influence from economics and consumers, but it will not have its ability to shape the public policy around it and that public policy change. Instead, it continues to ignore it because we're caught up in this 50-50 partisan battle on every single issue, where if you say I'm in favor of something, my job, my reason for existence is to say the opposite of what you said. And that's what's terrible about this country. And that's because it's not unusual in politics, but it's really divisive, and it creates just this deadlock, and it turns people away, and it makes people revert to their echo chambers where they're listening to the same thing over and over again instead of trying to at least hear what the other side has to say. Those days seem to be over.
I think you're right. And look, all we can do is go about and do our jobs the best we can, try to send the right message as we move forward. Hope that somebody who makes a difference in terms of government policy will listen to us honestly and truthfully engage in solutions to the things that they have concerns about, and ultimately be willing to normalize through a truthful and positive message instead of our just say no scare tactics that, while on the one hand, nobody wants school children to start using drugs. On the other hand, sometimes things like that get taken just a little too far. At any rate, Bob, on all of this, we could continue to talk, and we're going to have to do it again. But my producer here, Dan, is giving me these, terrible cut signals that if we don't stop soon, it's going to be a long night of editing for him, and nobody wants that for Dan Humiston. So, on the way out here, we're gonna play an outro for our fans, and it's going to be a clip from Broke Down Palace, always one of my favorite tunes. Another gem from American Beauty, so another new one at the time. So because it's relatively new, you hear them really, again, playing with the same energy we've heard throughout the show. I mean, I don't know about you, but for me, it was never the bad news about a Grateful Dead show, but inevitably they all ended. Inevitably, the show ended. You had to find your coat. You had to find your shoes. You had to go back out there and either go to your job or go back to school or to do whatever. And, so the idea of, the encore took on great significance because this is it. What are you going to do? Some encores were good. Some others weren't. I never heard anybody complain about Broke Down Palace. And I never saw anybody come out of a show after Broke Down Palace who didn't have a big grin on their face.
Yeah, I agree. And in the interest of time, I'm going to just ask you one question on this topic. When you have an encore, do you like an encore that is we bid you good night, Broke Down Palace, a ripple, something that makes you walk out with a huge smile on your face, but mellow? Or do you like to come out, with the not fade away ending or the one more Saturday night, just come out on a high note where, yes, there's not enough music. There's never enough music. But do you want to come out shot out of a cannon, or do you want to come out with that big smile on your face like, you know what? I just had a wonderful meal. It's time to go take a nap.
You know what? Unfortunately, it would take me the length of another episode for us to really hash that one out to any kind of a reasonable conclusion, right? You just go with the show, baby. Whatever the Dead are ready to give me, I'm ready to take. And But to that point when you get broke down, and they could pick it up a little bit, but it was just a nice, sweet tune, and it would send you out into the night, and you just be ready to go. So, Bob, again, thank you so much for the time. I know you're a busy guy; you're traveling all over the place, and personally, it's always great to get to talk to you. And from the perspective of the show, it's wonderful to have a guy like you on who checks all of our boxes intelligently, with a lot of knowledge, and it's a lot of fun. Thank you for being here.
No, it's my pleasure, Larry. I'll see you in Wrigley Field this summer.
I will look forward to it, Bob. Thank you very much. To all of our listeners, thank you again for listening. Please join us next week. Have a great week in between, and enjoy your cannabis responsibly. Broke Down Palace.
To plan a weekend by the bank's green edge, it will sing a lullaby beside the water. Lovers come and go, the river roll, roll, roll. Fare you well, fare you well. I love you more than words can tell. Listen to the river sing sweet songs to my soul.
Thanks for listening to today's show. To check out more great cannabis podcasts, go to PodConx.com. Here's a preview of one of our other shows.
Tune into a major journey podcast today, where guests take listeners on journeys and immerse themselves in the roller coaster ride both in and out of the cannabis space that brought them to where they are today. Throughout our conversations, guests share valuable lessons that they've learned along the way that listeners can use to empower growth both in their personal and professional lives. Check out A Major Journey today on all major podcast platforms.